As he prepares to embark upon the riverine narrative of a week on the Concord and Merrimack rivers, Thoreau gives us this meditative rhapsody upon the flowing surface to which he will soon surrender his person. I had often stood on the banks of the Concord, watching the lapse of the current, an emblem of all progress, following the same law with the system, with time, and all that is made. The shining pebbles, not yet anxious to better their condition, the chips and weeds and occasional logs and stems of trees that floated past, fulfilling their fate, were objects of singular interest to me, and at last I resolved to launch myself on its bosom and float whither it would bear me. Reading Robert Adamson's latest collection of poetry, The Goldfinches of Baghdad, is not unlike drifting down Thoreau's Concord, or any number of other literary rivers, for that matter. Wordsworth's Derwent, Twain's Mississippi, Spencer's Thames. Except this poet's stream of consciousness, Australia's Hawkesbury, has a decidedly ornithological streak to it. Indeed, this collection's table of contents reads like the glossary to Sibley's Guide to Birds, with titles like The Greenshank, Whistling Kites, Yellow Bittern, Gang Gang Cockatoos, Eclectus Parrot, Red-Necked Avocet, Rainbow Bee-Eaters, the Peach-Faced Finches of Madagascar, the Dollar Bird, the Cowbird, the Flag-Tailed Bird of Paradise, the Goldfinches of Baghdad, Brahminy Kite, and the Apostle Bird. It's rare to come across a book whose table of contents alone reads like a poem. But this is only a prologue to literary pleasures to come. For Adamson's Hawkesbury is not only a naturalist's dream vision. It bears a mythic aspect as well. Part Phlegethon, part River Elf. The river that runs through this book is the river of desire. There are many poems here on of erotic awakening. The river of death. Many poems are devoted to the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. And, in the end, the river into which all of these tributaries lead, namely, the river of language. We would all do well to surrender ourselves to the flow of this utterance. Born in Sydney, Robert Adamson has published at least 15 collections of poetry by my count, including Canticles on the Skin, Theatre, Where I Come From, The Brutality of Fact, Waving to Heart Crane, The Language of Oysters, Meaning, and Black Water. His new and selected collection, Mulberry Leaves, is available through Blood Axe Books, and The Goldfinches of Baghdad is now available from Flood Editions. The recipient of many awards and prizes, including the National Book Council's Banjo Award, the New South Wales Literary Awards Kenneth Slessor Prize, and the Victorian Premier's Literary Award for Poetry, Adamson has also received the FAW Christopher Brennan Prize in 1994 for Lifetime Achievement in Literature. He has exerted a great influence on Australian poetry, not only through his own work, but also through his activities as a publisher and as an editor. He manages and edits Paperbark Press with his wife Juno Jeames and fellow writer and academic Michael Wilding. Please join me in welcoming Robert Adamson.
Thanks so much for that. That was really good. I'm glad you mentioned Edmund Spenser. He's in one of my poems. I'm going to read from two books. This is my English selected poems, and this is my American book, published by Flood Editions, beautifully published by Flood Editions. I wouldn't be here if it hadn't been for two things, Poetry Chicago and Devon Johnson. I knew Poetry Chicago for many years. But during the 80s, I don't know, maybe I'll offend somebody here, but at some stage it was really quite boring. And I don't know when that was. But then one day I picked it up. I think it was in the late might have been 1998 or 99 or something like that. And I picked it up and I thought, wow, what's happening here? This is great. It's fantastic. It was in a bookshop and bought it immediately. Went home and read it from the cover to the end in one night, and I was very excited by it. It had references to all my favourite poets, and they were all reactivated as if they were still alive. Zukofsky and Robert Duncan and Robert Creeley and all sorts of other people that I can't even remember now. So I thought, I'd like to be published in this journal, but they won't have heard of me. So I'll write a letter to the editor and introduce myself and send a book. So I wrote to Devon, and he wrote back, which is quite unusual too for editors that have been deluged with thousands of poems and poets. And we started a correspondence, and Devon published me in Chicago Review, and then Eric finally, how do you pronounce it? It's not Eric, is it? It's Eric, sorry. Eric followed that up later with the first chapter of my autobiography. I'll read out the poem, the first poem, or one of the first poems I sent to Devon. I do a lot of things by imagining. When I'm so very interested in birds, and so many poets write about birds and give them human characteristics, anthropomorphic type things. Like a great example is Ted Hughes's Crow, which I loved that book when I first got it, and then after about halfway through, after about 3 days, this crow started to get blacker and blacker, and I realised it was more about Ted Hughes than the crow, which was fine once you sort of understand that. So what I do is try to get inside a bird's head, which of course you can't do. We never know what thankfully I think we'll never know what a bird thinks. But I imagine not being the bird, but being in the bird's head and proceeding through the landscape. It's kind of a 17th century idea, but I think it works. I'll just read out some poems now after all that. This is The Stone Curlew. I'm writing this inside the head of a bush stone curlew. We have been travelling for days, moving over the earth, flying when necessary. I am not the bird itself, only its passenger, looking through its eyes. The world rocks slightly as we move over the stubble grass of the dunes. At night, shooting stars draw lines across the velvet dark as I hang in a sling of light between the bird's nocturnal eyes. The heavens make sense seeing this way. Makes me want to believe words have meanings, that Australia is no longer a wound in the side of the earth. I think of the white settlers who compared the curlew's song to the cries of women being strangled, and I remember the poets who wrote anthropomorphically as I sing softly from the jelly of the stone curlew's brain. This is called What I Have of Faith. It comes from a line in a Hart Crane poem, the title. I love that line, what I have of faith. If you look out the window, you will see nothing. The willow is flowing nicely. You'll be blind and hear the sound of poetry read by a woman who reviews owls. Like an owl split in two by a cat, flying off in two directions. On this side, a sprig of inkweed. On the other, Tasmanian kelp. Here, language comes out at night and mixes with the locals. Who knows what is getting done aside from talking? The serious tone is more assuring, well, more than laughter. For some reason, things change tonight. We hear a muted thudding a good night for the litter of kittens. Hawks circle the kitchen light. Moths with beaks come flying out. Nothing surreal. The lawn man walks in with a glad bag, dropping feathers. You must remember to reassemble the goldfinch before the refreshments. That's a reference to those mechanical birds that Yeats sometimes talks about. And this is sort of like a bit of prose. I wrote this when Australia was having bicentennial celebrations, celebrating 200 years of white settlement. I think you're about 100 years ahead of us. I haven't really added up the numbers, I'm hopeless at figures. But white people had been in Australia 200 years when I wrote this. And of course there was all the jingoistic stuff on the television telling us how great we were, how great Australia was. And I refer to that. It's called Clearwater Reckoning. I'm reading this to describe to you sort of where I write. And it's about 1990 or something when I wrote this. And I live on this house on a point in a beautiful river. And inside the house I have this big room full of books. And I sit at the desk. When my wife goes away on a tour or to one of her various exhibitions of photographs, I sit there and this is what happens. I don't sleep much. I just read books and try to write poems. Clearwater Reckoning. I write into the long black morning, out here on the end of the point, far from my wife in Budapest. As the river cuts through a mountain in Sydney, a poet is launching his new volume, Under Berlin. And I feel like Catullus on Rome's edge. But this passes, and I turn to face the oncoming dawn. The house breathes tidal air as the night fires outside with barking owls, marsupials rustling, the prawn bird beginning its taunting dawn whistle. I burn the electricity and measure hours by the line. I have strewn words about the living room, taken them out from their sentences, left them unused wherever they fell. They are the bait. I hunch over my desk and start to row. Let the tide flow out. Watch the window with the door locked now. I wait. I hear satin bowerbirds scratching out seeds from the bottle brush. Dawn is a thin slit of illuminated bowerbird blue along the mountain lines. In this year of cock and bull celebration, the TV goes on, unwatched, upstairs. I hear it congratulating us for making Australia what it is. The heater breathes out a steady stream of heated air. I go deeper into my head. I see the Hawkesbury flowing through Budapest. The Hungarians do not seem to mind. They are bemused. The river parts around their spires and domes. I see other cities, whole cultures drawn from territories within. Though with this freedom comes a feeling of strange panic for the real. So I get on with it, riding out from this egg, holding my thought in a turbulent knot, a bunched up octopus. I steer away from anything confessional, thinking of Robert Lowell, crafting lines of intelligent blues, his jelly roll of a self-caught mess deep in spiritual distress. Outside the river pulls me back. Shafts of light disintegrate into clues. Flecked symbols shine with order. The bowerbirds have woven colour around the house. Through the bushes, blue patterns of themselves, traced about the place. Half the moon can topple a mountain. Anything is possible here, I remind myself, and begin to hum, flattening out all the words that were impossible to write today. I hum out all the poems I should have written. I hum away now also the desire to write from memory. There is enough sorrow in the present. I look out over the incoming tide. Dark racks of oysters jut from its ink. It's like a picture of my head and my sort of place. This one's more a poem. I love America, and well, with the exception of the Coalition of the Willing and their advertising agencies, for dreadful phrases like that. But Australia's one of your allies. We've got one battleship. We help you out in the Gulf. Or for some kind of political metaphor. Luckily, they're not poets. Yeah, we'd be in trouble then. I love American pop culture too, and I don't think I would have been a poet if it hadn't been for Bob Dylan, and then Hopkins and Wallace Stevens. And I love your music, all of it, but I love country music. I love Emmylou Harris and Lucinda Williams and Gillian Welsh. This one's I wrote listening to Emmylou Harris. Swimming out with Emmylou Harris, along curved horizon, the hazel-coloured tide, and Lion Island going by. A CD player skips on the line, quarter moon in a 10-cent town. On the swell, our wake shatters the reflection of the real moon. We cut through the sound of swimming, the meaningless joy of living, the random punishment of birth. The song says, we all live up to what we get. Out here, you believe whoever writes the script. Yesterday is reflected back by the moon. Mothers wash the sickly smell from a dozen ruined shirts every Saturday afternoon. Wives turn their heads. There's an old grey stingray spread-eagled across the front of the chicken run. 3 crows hop around it, the breeze ruffling their satin collars. They plunge their black beaks into the lukewarm flesh. Emmylou, your sweet, holy music drifts through the new curtains. Your song folds itself around the shack, filling the backyard, flowing through our days. Out on the back veranda where old Dutch sits slumped 2 days into his latest coma. Sweet Lord, sweet poison, sweet, sweet music. I'll skip through for those. Robert Duncan came to Australia. I organised a tour for him there. I corresponded with him for a long time. I think he's one of the greatest poets ever. When he came to Australia, I took him to see my grandfather, who was a fisherman who couldn't read or write, and they got on really well. They talked about Hank Williams. I told that to Michael Palmer. He said, I didn't think Duncan knew anything about Hank Williams. And then he thought again and said, Duncan knew everything about everything. Something about everything, I'm sorry. This is kind of based on that experience called Black Water. I took Robert Duncan in my grandfather's skiff, rowing across Mooney Creek. Words hummed around our heads. The trees are speaking on the far shore. We'll never get there in time. The pages of books swim upstream. We study words growing on them. The time will come and you will turn the present. A breeze that passes sweeps up, carrying the odour the mower is creating as he moves through the rushes looking for glowworms. Words, little warm animals of air. Words growing and teeming over the mudflats. The river has no bends. This river is not an actual river, yet this water has burnt its right of way into the sandstone. Great sheets of it slide by on either side, parting and taking the flotsam. the mower creates. For she my mind hath so displaced that I shall never find my home. Marvell was calling from the mangroves, our souls, crows, gliding down to eat the words time created, endless bends. The river was never the same. That night, Duncan gathered the southern stars into his being, the black water plopping with fat mullet. That's a fish we have there. I don't know whether you have mullet. And I started reading some poets that are called language poets. And Robert Duncan told me to keep away from them. But I wasn't a big leap from Zhukovsky's poetry to some of the earlier language poets. So I just played around with some of the freedoms that they, or maybe disciplines that they created. This is called a day book for Eurydice. The day book comes from the idea Creeley had of writing down whatever comes into your head. I mean, you can do that if you're Robert Creeley. I'll just read some of these. They're sort of sonnets, 13-line sonnets, and it's a bit like Jack Spicer's idea of placing the Holy Grail myth in the streets of San Francisco in the 50s or 40s and 50s, where you just bring it all up to date. This is set in Sydney, Australia, and I'm thinking of Eurydice and Orpheus, of course. A sprig of delphinium. It's also, there's times, 2 p.m, 4 p.m, and so on. It's sort of, they're going through a night together. I guess it's Orpheus and Eurydice, and Orpheus is drinking Southern Comfort, and so things get strange. She saw hoops in his eyes, behind the brown cordage of opaque veins, wheels of light. I believed him. In this fashionable precinct there is a cafe where the pagans hang out. The perpendicular city shoots up and the sky is smudged across the window. A bevy of road peckers rule the roost, but don't worry. If anyone walks in on us, maybe they'll skid into an imbroglio and have some gratuitous fun. If gender is a foreign language, let's drop expectations. Sleight of word and be impetuous. Take this sprig of delphinium, my chatterbox. Our lives will change. That's Eurydice, who's never spoken a word in all the myth, saying to Orpheus, just quieten down for a while. I've heard all those songs. You might impress the king of hell, but you won't impress me. 4 p.m, raining italics. He travels heavy, lopsided, slanting home, leaving behind the scene in the cafe. What's pertinent now? What type of flower will shoot from his eye when he endeavours to create his paradise? He walks the streets of the inner city, enduring his limbo, calm as a sentence not including weather. When he trundles through the gates, he knows there will be phosphor-headed floozies and acceptance. He remembers his mother pruning geraniums. He played in her garden with his hoop and watched the rainbow. Time is fascinating, yet vile. Rain creates acrid fumes. The transcribed hoop, 6 p.m. We are lines in a hand-coloured lithograph. We watch a hoop trying to bowdlerise itself. Strange markings. These lines have been forced onto the paper. You can read the result of the printer's pathetic yodeling. In the small hours he practised his calligraphy, his imagination's gyrating tonnage. His scribbling was a fine exercise until he decided to transcribe it. What his brilliant inspiration amounted to was simply heavy doodling. Every day he said, tomorrow. He'd frame it up and make a presentation. A Valentine. He'd tear his chest apart. Self-critical to a T, he rolled it up and posted it off in a tube. This is another quote from Hart Crane. The visible, the untrue. 1 p.m. This room has existed for all these years in Edmund Spenser's head. A gnome works there on an etching of a hummock. His first sketch was drawn from life one day as he lay out by the juniper, attending to those details nature did omit. Breaking bread mixed in with Edmund's substance base, true Jonathan does some kind of dance and raves. The Fairy Queen is a drag show bedecked and scored with synthetic cloth and acrylic glitter. They eat the drumsticks of the bird of paradise. Their great ideals have been mollified by grim lust. Their geodesic discotheque is held together by art alone. The Bower of Bliss, 1 a.m. Getting a bit weirder now. Birds, well, you know where this comes from. If you read 17th century poetry, Spenser. Birds, voices, instruments, winds, waters, all agree. The windpipe created a melodious tone as the blade sunk home. Although sorcery is not in fashion, it worked. The mask of Cupid fell, revealing a man without a hat, a murderous swine cold as a jobfish. If we translate the circuitous murmuring of hooves bowled along, if we squint a picture or form from the sounding, it will turn out to be the blonde woman from Blonde on Blonde, the sad-eyed lady herself. She has a rendezvous tomorrow under a juniper tree with a landscape painter. They'll exchange sketches outside on the street, drunk as a shadow-boxing neon. I'll end with this one. Nothing on the mind, 3 a.m. The gnome's akubra is a part of his head. He drinks Jack and Coke. At last they've come up with an alcoholic robot. Let me tell you, ambition leads to imitation oak. The weight of eyes rides on my cheeks until blotchy flowers become thoughts feeding my brain. Venomous butterflies flit through my eardrums. When the limits fall away, brightness flares about. There is no shade, nothing but illumination on a sea of drink. Philosophers I swallowed undigested swim in circles, bronze whalers of the intellect. You can't dream in this slipstream of blood. Your punishment is to think. I'll skip all that. There's about 10 more of those. I started having too much fun, I think. I'll read some poems from my new book now. When Australia started bombing, along with America, Baghdad, I looked at the news and saw all these flames, and I was pretty upset about that. And especially with Australia's Prime Minister, who makes these grand gestures, sends one battleship there, and sucks up to Bush for some obscure reason. But I thought, it takes a lot of aggression to send these young men in a battleship all the way from the bottom of the earth, bottom of the world, right up to the Gulf in Arabia, in Iraq. And I just got upset seeing the bombing. And of course, when this happened, lots of poets all around the world started writing anti-war poems. And it's very hard to write anti-war poems, especially if you deal directly with the politics of the situation, because you don't really know the politics. They don't become apparent, of course, for years later. And you just know it's wrong. But, what do you say? So I just wrote a sonnet every day it happened. And after a week or so, I had a dozen sonnets. And I threw them all out except for 2. And I did it by thinking of birds again, and I thought of the traditions in Baghdad of falconry, and they also had goldfinches that sang beautiful songs. and they used, well, the whole ancient culture and the beautiful writings, beginning of script. So I wrote this. I saw a headline on the Sydney Morning Herald, which is one of Australia's largest newspapers, and it said, George W. Bush instructed the enemy to hold up white flags and stand 20 metres away from their tanks, promising that if they did, they would be spared. I thought of this bird called the flag-tailed bird of paradise, which was collected in New Guinea in the 1910 by one of the Rothschilds. I've forgotten his name, but he was a famous bird collector. And he sold them to zoos. They're extinct now, but they were in captivity. They kept going right through to the 50s, I think. So I imagine this long, beautiful, if you ever get a chance to look it up, it's quite difficult to find. They're not on the net as far as I can find, but you can find them in libraries. The flag-tailed bird of paradise, it has these beautiful plumes with little white flags. So I was thinking of that image of those, Saddam's special troops, the ones that cleverly took their uniforms off and threw their guns away and ran away. I thought they were really, really smart doing that. So I thought of them holding up white flags without writing about them. Here's the bird. Thought to be extinct, they are appearing through the red mist, their white tails waving at blunt helicopters, splattering the earth. These creatures from paradise play dead when attacked. They freeze, clamped to a branch, the tiny flags of their tails barely shimmering in the broken sunlight. They once lived in jungles on islands in the Pacific, but haven't been found dead there since 1958. Some escaped to Arabia, sold to collectors and bred in captivity. They were taken up by zoos, kept in palaces and inbred. Flunkies fed them and sultans hovered about them, marvelling at how they became extraordinary in their deformities. Their cream-coloured plumage shot through with pale, beautiful rainbows. Their eyes, enormous, pink, and their flag tails, heavy, almost too heavy to hold up, but not theirs to withhold. And this one's called this is the title poem of the book. The Goldfinches of Baghdad. These finches are kept in gold cages or boxes covered in wire mesh. They're used by falcon trainers as lures, and rich patriarchs choose these living ornaments to sing to them on their deathbeds. Their song is pure and melodious. A goldfinch with a slashed throat was the subject of a masterpiece painted in the 16th century on the back of a highly polished mother of pearl shell. It burns tonight in Baghdad, along with the living, caged birds, flesh and feathers, hands and wings. Sirens wail, but the tongues of poets and the beaks of goldfinches burn. Those who cannot speak burn, along with the articulate. Creatures oblivious to prayer burn, along with those who lament to their God. Falcons on silver chains, the children of the falcon trainer, smother in the smoke of burning feathers and human flesh. We sing or die, singing death as our songs feed the flames. Okay. I'll try and read something a bit more hopeful. I wrote this poem when this wonderful exhibition of Paul Cézanne's paintings came to Sydney, and my wife Juno said, we've got to go and see this exhibition, it's fun, because she knows I don't want to go out even to see one of my favourite painters. But I said, yeah, okay, let's go. And I forgot about it, and I was writing an autobiography, I think, about some dark period in my past. But the words were coming out, and then Juno said, it's tonight. I said, oh God, I can't stop writing. this is really important. I have to keep writing. And she said, okay, and she went. And when she drove off, I thought, oh, I'm terrible sometimes. I'm writing about love and death and Eurydice and Orpheus, and yet I don't go to see Paul Cézanne with my wife, who I love. I think this is more important. Like, as Mallarmé said, the white abyss, we're trying to put these little black letters on these pages to create our own universes, our own galaxies of stars. Mallarmé used to look at the night sky and see the stars, and he said, the stars are the alphabet of God, scattered across the black abyss. But then he looked back to his own work after his son died at a very early age, and he lost faith in any form of God, and became, well, he describes a spiritual crisis where he talks about his work and what he wants to do. He had this concept that all his poems would be a book, and that everything existed in the world only to exist in the book. But then he goes on in a letter to a friend describing why he can't talk. He didn't have a phone, but he wouldn't answer the phone. He can't go to the cafe, can't have his Tuesday night workshops. But what he describes is very close to Buddhism. It's worth reading. And he also talks about this, getting back to Cézanne from that. Cézanne worked from the edges of his canvases out into the middle. And it's this beautiful layering effect, which is like the opposite to, say, somebody like Rambo, who jabs and jerks sharply with brilliance. But this is another way of looking at art, or doing art, creating art. And possibly another way of thinking about, how would you say, enacting love, rather than just contemplating it. I think of the waste, the long years of not believing, the tongue pretending in the midst of words to speak, to keep walking that bend in the road. I cursed myself for not having spoken. The blank sheets of air could have added words, smudged out and revised with a colour, stroked instead of butting, coming to the shape by layers, stumbling in from the corners and rubbing out the hard light. The countless fish flapping on boards, have they just disappeared? There's no way back to the water to catch again that possible colour. Outside the window, the black night, mosquitoes gather under the floodlights on the pontoon until the empty westerly blows. Everything that matters comes together, slowly, the hard way, with the immense and tiny details, with all the infinite touches put down onto nothing. Each time we touch, it begins again. Love, quick brushstrokes, building up the undergrowth from the air into what holds. What holds? I said to Robert Creeley once when he was in Sydney, how do you know a good poem from a bad poem? And he sort of laughed. He said, you only know if it works. If it works, it's good. I wrote this to Creeley about 2 years before he died last year. This is 1 year exactly, I think, today from his death, or yesterday. I think he was just the greatest love poet in the English language since maybe John Donne or someone like that. Poets who he loved, those early English love poets. I've heard the system's closing down. It's good reading in books, old friend, your words about what a friend is, if you have one. These days I often think of Zhukovsky, just throwing in the word objectivist, and how it works as well as any label could. These days we're just words away from death, and I think I've finally learnt to listen. Your love songs seem wise now that the years have steadied my head. As you turn hurt without sentiment to gain, I thought of your clear humour when my father was dying of cancer. I asked about the pain, and he spun me a line. It feels like a big mud crab having a go at my spine. And this is a poem I wrote, it's a letter to Tom Rayworth, the English poet who I believe has been here. I didn't start writing until I was about 26, 24 or something like that. And I left school when I was 12. I got in trouble because I had some form of dyslexia. But because I wasn't stupid, the teachers sort of made it more difficult because they would call my mother and father and say, this boy is bright and he's deliberately not doing mathematics. He comes top in English and art, but he comes bottom in everything else. And I used to cry, I used to go home crying because I couldn't learn the tables, you know, the 5 times tables, 4 times, all that. I couldn't remember any numbers. I still can't remember my telephone number. Juno has to pull it out. I love computers though, because you don't have to spell or remember numbers. But when I started reading poetry, the first poet, well, there was Bob Dylan, you know, and I just didn't know what a genius he was. And when I heard him, he just sounded so great and so utterly unlike anything else I'd ever experienced. And he was full of hope. And he just loved words, and I loved his voice and his music, everything. But then I thought I'd write some songs like him. I'd be a singer, but I couldn't sing and I couldn't play a guitar. So I showed these songs to a Jesuit priest and said, here are my songs. I didn't have any money and I didn't want to work. But I didn't want to go back to reform school or prison. So I thought I'll go and see a Jesuit, you know. And I said, here are my songs. He came back a week later and said, these aren't songs, they're poems. And you know, that was the last thing I wanted to hear, because my friends were, you know, doing wheelies up at the milk bar in their V8 Mustangs and custom lines, and they weren't impressed by poetry at all. They weren't even impressed by Bob Dylan. Like, my interest in Bob Dylan was weird enough, but poetry, I mean, they like Frank Sinatra and Jack Jones. They were kind of watching too many movies, you know, they thought they were gangsters or something. But then I found this, the Jesuit gave me a book of Hopkins. He was a first language poet. Like, he's amazing. Like, you can read it now alongside any of the latest sort of books by good poets, and there's all the energy in that language. Every single syllable, every word is concentrated until it explodes. And of course, his famous word that describes an epiphany that happens as you join a line of words together that might coincide with something in nature. Inscape, which is a fantastic word just in itself. But I picked up this book of Tom Rayworth in a shop somewhere, and it was unlike the other poet. I started to read the Australian poets, and they were pretty boring. They were sort of Victorian, leftovers from the Victorian era, most of them, with sort of sing-song, iambic pentameters and terrible rhymes, and not saying an awful lot. But when I read Tom Rayworth, I thought, it somehow gave me permission to I describe what it does in the poem. So I hadn't met Tom. I've written to him and corresponded with him. He's kind of been a constant friend for over 35 years or more. I finally met him in Boulder just last week, and it was so good. But this is a very important experience that led me on. It's in here. Before escaping from the clock self imposes on the page in those days, I could hardly talk, and called you in my head, Tom Raw Worth. There was some kind of criminal in that poem of yours called Morel, The brown end papers of moving were doors I slunk through. I lived in those pages, free from narrative, speaking a language I could read, not utter. The light led me through chambers of murmurings, calling me, I thought, in the pitch of your voice, though it was streets, not spires, where the books were, not blocks of stone or holy glass, but a sly, side-of-the-mouth code, serious song that wouldn't parry or fuck with you for exclaiming, "These lines are wonderful." These tough folk are not embarrassed by wonder. Morell's keys to the prison jingled as you walked up walls. Your head took the weight and made the weirdness surrounding me release small change to pay for sheets of creamy Fabriano that was soon transformed into a kind of folding money, so the Morells could pay for their keys. And on each page I made appeared that watermark, raw worth. Well, here's a poem I wrote for the Johns. It's kind of a pun on what call girls call their clients, the Johns, but really it's for John Ashbery, John Tranter, and John Forbes. John Forbes is an Australian poet who's a bit like a cross between Ted Berrigan and John Ashbery, with an Australian accent and his own slant on the world. He died when he was young. He came to New York once. He came on a pilgrimage to see Ted Berrigan. I think he went to, it was either in New York or in Bolinas. He was going to go and talk to Berrigan and show Berrigan his poems. But he saw Berrigan going to a Pepsi machine and taking out a Pepsi and walking away. And that was enough for John. He came back to Australia and told us, "I saw Ted Berrigan getting a Pepsi out of a Pepsi machine." And he wrote a poem, a fantastic poem called "To the Bobby Dazzlers," which is about. But John died of drinking cough medicine. He was like Berrigan a bit. He liked speed. He didn't care about his diet that much. So he's alluded to in this poem. And John Tranter's got a magazine jacket. He's been my peer for my first book on. One of my peers. And in 1968, we kind of got all these books of John Ashbery. He didn't write as much then, but each book was like a new world. And we'd get them in Sydney, Australia, and talk about them and read them. So the book talks about all that. And we used to take the poems to Sydney University and taunt the professors with them. They'd say, oh well, here we go. "We loved the front, your wall of words, and the fact that snatches made sense to the professors. We read The Double Dream of Spring and argued fiercely about whether it was the way to go. Tied knots in your tangles, tendrils of phrases that wound their way around the pages. Those were the days we exist in now. We hacked through time and came out twisted. Gaping holes in space, we fed on sentences stitched together with a grammar that was streetwise, though with impeccable manners that always got us through the gates. The mix of sweetness and a ferocity that could burn holes was what I admired most in some trees. Those poems were places I made friends in. I remember Tranter standing in a classroom, reading them, his laughter edged with irony and kindness. Ashbery days, when poets were drunk on code within code, when language cracked open and showed us the power of whimsy and a dark abyss that said, perhaps, as it echoed. Got a bit more time, I think. I'll just read from the beginning of the book. There's a series of poems in the beginning of my new book. That's the muse in hell being fed by a bird. I don't know what muse. It's a friend of mine that did that cover. an artist, a really great Australian artist by the name of Gary Shedd. This poem came out of a dream. A bend in the Euphrates. In a dream, on a sheet of paper, I saw a pencil drawing of lovers. They seemed perfect. Adam and Eve, possibly. Stepping into reality, I read lines of a poem on a piece of crumpled rag I kept trying to smooth. Egyptian linen, so fine it puzzled to imagine such a delicate loom. In a flash I saw 2 dirty-breasted ibis and heard their heads swish. Black bills swiped the cloudy stream. And in the rushes I heard needles stitching, weaving features into the landscape, clacking as they shaped an orange tree, then switched a beat to invent blue-black feathers for crows. The pointed wedges of their beaks, a fox rustled through the wild lantana as I stepped through into the garden and, becoming part of the weave, noticed the tide turn, its weight eroding mud banks, bringing filth in from the ocean. A raft of flotsam breaks away, a duckling perched on the thicket of its hump. I used the murky river for my ink, draw bearings on a piece of cloth, sketch a pair of cattle egrets, bullying teal into flight. The maps folded away. I travel by heart now. Old lessons are useless. I shelter from bad weather in the oyster farmer's shack. The moon falls in a column of light, igniting a glowing epicycle. This pale spot on my writing table. These fragments of regret. My editor, Christopher Edwards, said, "What are the fragments of regret? I mean, they're not in the poem." I said, well, let's put it first in the book, and then as the reader goes through the book, they'll find them. He said, that's very clever, Bob, but it doesn't solve the problem. This is my wife's uncle was a great Hungarian poet called Miklos Radnóti. He was like a he could write poems as beautiful as Paul Verlaine, but he also had more of a hard edge or a social conscience. He was Jewish, and he was put in the labour camps when the Germans invaded Hungary. But just as the war ended, 1944, I think it was, or 1943, he was about to be released, but he was marched by the Hungarian fascists. The Hungarian government had joined the Hitler, well, some of the Hungarian, and he was being forced marched back towards where he lived, and one of his friends fell down, and he tried to help his friend, and they shot him. When he died, and later the family went and found the body in a ditch and dug it up. And in his pocket they found his notebook full of poems with a bullet hole right through the notebook. And so they made this wonderful facsimile of that. You can get that. He was very loved by the Hungarian people. They were stamps. They made stamps in his memory. So I thought, how can I met his wife. Juno's mum introduced me to Fifi, who's still alive. She's about 90, I think. 90. She's a marvellous woman. I took her to the shops one day, and she said there was this car parked in a space for the handicapped. She said, "Look at that. That's the worst crime you can commit, parking in a space for the handicapped." I mean, she was ferocious, but I thought, yeah, that's sort of rigorous. Okay, so I used a bird and migration metaphor. Miklos Radnóti marched from forced labour into Yugoslavia, back into Hungary, came to rest near a bend in the Radica, at what his translator describes as a strange, lonely place where the tributary joins the great river, a marshland watched over by willows and high circling birds. Condors, perhaps, they appear in the notes and the poems he was writing under a foamy sky. Huddled in a trench with the body of a friend who'd been shot in the neck, he wrote with a pencil stub in his notebook, "Patience flowers into death." His wife's face bloomed in his head. Thinking of the petals of crushed flowers floating in a wake of perfume, he wrote to caress her neck. The fascists' bullets wiped out his patience. His written petals survive. Today we listen to the news of war. Here in a river sanctuary, my wife's unbending will has created horizontal slats of cedar, verticals of glass, a Mondrian chapel of light. This afternoon, just before dark, the first greenshank arrived from the Hebrides, ignorant of human borders. Its migration technology is simple: feathers and fish fuel, cryptic colour and homing instinct. This elegant wader landed on a mooring, got ruffled in the westerly, then took off again, an acrobatic twister. It levelled down onto a mudflat, a lone figure that dashed across the shore, stood on one leg, then, conducting its song with its bill, came forward in a high stepping dance. That's Miklos, you know, as he's writing his poem, shot down. How long have I got left, do you think? Anyone know? Okay, do you want to hear some more? I'll read a few more? Okay. I'll read some of the Eurydice poems. This is a new version of Eurydice. She's not modernised so much here. She's sort of pastoral Eurydice. The Floating Head. This is sort of a take on, you know, where that Orpheus gets ripped apart by his whatever they were, Maynards, incarnations of all his old girlfriends, tearing him apart. The Floating Head. I turned off the electricity, pulled telephone cords out of the wall, saw stars in glass through cedar slats. I wrapped a scarf around my headache and looked inside. An ebbing memory leaving with the tide. The boat's motor roared and I hurtled across the river into a blazing cold night and circled back. Crouched in a corner of the house, my cat borrows my voice. I talk to him through the night. The heater clicks, its pilot light blinks. I scribble a few lines, pass my fishing rod off as a liar. Who needs this bitter tune? Its distorted chords lull me into numbness. I bend it over double and pluck. So I thought I'll mix this ancient Greek myth with a Christian sort of metaphor somehow. And I thought, I'll put sort of born-again Christians in singing in tongues, and imagine one of them bringing, well, you know, when you get hysterical and sing in tongues, you can imagine anything. So it's a good way to get Eurydice back from hell again. A preacher came to Calabash Creek in an expensive four-wheel drive. He set up in the little park with his team of technicians. Bosey speakers hung from the gum trees. Kookaburras started laughing just before dark. An oyster farmer's punt full of drunks from the workers' club took off from the mudflats and roared into the night. They called us all a bunch of cunts. Before long, the children from the point were speaking in tongues. The singing was fabulous. A woman sang the Statesboro Blues. There was talk of miracles. Then the preacher spoke of hell. Suddenly my arms were full. You started sobbing. My face was wet with tears. You were back in paradise. some sort of hysterical Christian woman, you know. It's got to be Eurydice. She's never anywhere. She's just disappeared. She wasn't even a god, she was a human. She had that encounter with a snake, and a possible, I think she might have got off with a shepherd or something, and she was flung into hell. And she never speaks. She never, in any of those ancient texts, does she have any voice. There's been a few poets over the years, like H.D., a few others, that give her words. But, yeah, I see her in lots of things. Eurydice and the tawny frog-mouth owl. My wife loves seeing these beautiful Australian owls. They have whiskers, and they can turn their head around like in The Exorcist, like Linda Blair. But they're kind of sweet. They don't go off. They just sort of stay calm. They look around and just kill a mouse or something. On the arch above our gate, he looks out through a fringe of feathers, hunting, then places one foot on black cast iron and ruffles his head. His other foot is clenched in the night air, held out in an atmosphere of waiting, then unclenched. Those nights, flying with you, weighed no more or less than this. I kept saying, because Devon came to our place and saw some of these birds, and Devon Johnson, and I kept sending him that poem. I write, quick drafts, and I get excited, but I don't show them to that many people. I know he'll forgive me. So I send it to him, and he says, that's really interesting. And then I'll do another version, and I think about 10 versions until I got it right. And then I changed it. I think I changed a couple of these poems, write it in the last... Devon sent me the page proofs to check for any mistakes. It's been meticulously proofread by him and his partner, Michael, and probably Jeff, the designer as well. But I was looking through it, and I suddenly decided to rewrite a poem. So I rewrote it and sent it back to Devon. He said, I meant words. I meant like mistakes, not whole stanzas. But he put it in. So if you see a poem in here that's sort of where the lines aren't perfectly designed and they're broken, that's my fault, not the designers or the publisher. It only happens once. It's in a poem to Merrill Gilliff, and it's like the lines break and I bought in. I'll read that next. I'll read a couple more of the Eurydice one. This is where I try to get the courage up to create a persona that might actually speak for Eurydice. Letter to Eurydice. This leads up to the next one. Watercolour moon, window panes fogged up, outside the river slips by. An overhanging blackbutt branch inscribes the surface with a line across foaming runoff. Living near mudflats, I'm protected by mangroves. In winter, a southerly rakes their curly heads. The green skirts are my windbreak. At the fork, these summer thoughts are silted up and become obscure. It's more than halfway into a big ebb, and my mind's a dark moat. If you get this far, watch it. Step on my dreams, you'll find they've been pulped. It's only flight that matters here. Take a break and fling your next thought into the tide. In these parts, the lyrebird must carry its own cage on its back through the swamps. I once believed this, but yesterday the bird suffered a stroke. It keeps falling to the ground, the ranger said. Nothing can be done. It's time to commiserate with this creature, all songbird, but not quite lyre. It gets so confusing writing about Eurydice and Orpheus because you try not to identify. I mean, I don't imagine that I'm Orpheus at all, but the temptation's always there. And my wife says, "Who are these poems for?"